A nurse took the vampire king's blood pressure in the emergency room at 3 a.m., and the machine exploded in a shower of sparks. What no one knew, the reading had been 0/0 for 3 centuries, and now the entire hospital's surveillance system had recorded proof of what he was. The fluorescent lights of St. Mercy Hospital hummed their eternal monotone dirge at 3 in the morning when Lena Hartley pushed through the curtain of Cubicle 7 with a blood pressure cuff draped over her shoulder and exhaustion carved into the hollows beneath her eyes. 16 hours into a double shift meant her body moved on autopilot while her mind drifted somewhere between caffeine crash and the fantasy of her bed 3 bus stops away. The man waiting on the gurney looked wildly out of place in the sterile chaos of the ER, his charcoal suit cut with the kind of precision that whispered old money, and his posture too composed for someone claiming chest discomfort. Lena had seen enough malingerers and anxiety attacks to recognize when someone did not belong in her world of blood and beeping monitors and the particular smell of antiseptic mixed with human fear. She pulled the rolling stool closer and reached for his arm without bothering with small talk because at 3 in the morning, nobody wanted her bedside manner. Cassian Thorne had given his name to the intake nurse with the kind of smooth courtesy that made people forget to ask follow-up questions. And now he sat utterly motionless as Lena wrapped the cuff around his forearm and pressed the button to start the automatic reading. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The machine whirred to life, the cuff inflated with its familiar rhythmic squeeze. The digital display flickered once, then twice. Then the numbers appeared in stark red digits that made Lena's tired brain stutter to a confused halt. 0/0. She blinked hard and leaned closer because exhaustion played tricks and machines malfunctioned, and there had to be a rational explanation for why the monitor showed a reading that meant clinical death. The display began to strobe. A high-pitched whine erupted from somewhere deep in the machine's circuits. Cassian turned his head toward her, with movements too fluid and controlled, his eyes meeting hers with an expression she could not read. And then the blood pressure monitor exploded in a shower of sparks and acrid smoke that sent Lena jerking backwards so hard her stool tipped and clattered to the floor. The curtain ripped open. 2 nurses from the central station rushed in with Dr. Chen right behind them, his face creased with alarm as he took in the smoking ruins of the equipment, and Lena sprawled on the floor, and the man in the expensive suit who had not moved a single inch during the explosion. Cassian sat with his hands folded in his lap, and his expression calm as morning fog, no startle reflex, no elevated breathing, nothing that suggested a human response to sudden violence. Somewhere above them, the security cameras captured every frame with digital precision, the timestamp burning into the footage, the impossible reading seared into the monitor's final screenshot before it died. Lena's hands trembled as she pushed herself upright, because 17 years of nursing had taught her to recognize when something violated the fundamental rules of biology, and this man sitting serene and unruffled in the wreckage of a medical device had no pulse hammering in his throat, and no sweat beating his temples, and no way reactions that marked him as alive in the way she understood living. Dr. Chen crouched beside the destroyed monitor and prodded at the melted plastic with the cautious horror of someone encountering an anomaly that textbooks did not cover. He straightened and fixed Cassian with the particular stare physicians reserved for patients who were lying. "We need to recheck your vitals manually," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who would not be deflected by charm or excuses or expensive tailoring. Lena found herself reaching for Cassian's wrist before she could think better of it, her fingers pressing against the cool skin that felt wrong in a way that made her stomach clench, searching for the throb of an artery that should have been impossible to miss. Nothing. The skin under her fingertips carried the temperature of something that had been sitting in a room far colder than the overheated ER, and when she shifted her grip to find a different angle, her thumb slid over the radial artery where she should have felt the surge and release of blood moving through vessels, and instead felt only stillness. She looked up into Cassian's face and found him watching her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise. His pupils fixed and dilated in a way that her penlight confirmed when she flicked it across his eyes and saw no responsive constriction. Just that unnatural steadiness, like something old and patient observing her from behind a mask of human features. Dr. Chen moved closer with his stethoscope already in his ears, but Cassian spoke before the doctor could press the cold metal to his chest, his voice low and measured and carrying a strange formal cadence that reminded Lena of period dramas and courtroom oaths. The nightfall accords forbid exposure by modern surveillance. The words made no sense strung together like that, but they landed in the small space of the cubicle with the weight of something legal and binding and utterly serious, and Lena felt them settle into her exhausted brain like a threat wrapped in silk. Dr. Chen paused with his stethoscope halfway extended, confusion flickering across his features before his professional mask snapped back into place. "Sir, I need to examine." "You," he said with the patience of someone reasoning with the delusional. And Cassian met his gaze with a smile that looked almost apologetic and reached into his jacket pocket. For one wild moment, Lena thought weapon, but what he withdrew was a card embossed with text too small to read from where she stood, and a seal that looked like it had been pressed into the heavy stock with actual wax. Dr. Chen took the card and frowned at it, and frowned harder, his expression cycling through disbelief and reluctant acceptance in the space of 30 seconds. "I will need to verify this," he said slowly. "But if this documentation is legitimate, then we cannot compel you to undergo further examination without your consent." And Cassian inclined his head in a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and dismissal. "I understand," he said. "I will of course comply with whatever follow-up protocols you deem necessary," and the doctor's frown deepened, but he stepped back and told Lena to clean up the debris and schedule a follow-up appointment, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the man who had no heartbeat and a smoking pile of ruined medical equipment between them. Cassian waited until the curtain swung shut before he turned to her fully, and the composure cracked just enough for her to see something desperate underneath. "You saw the reading," he said, "and it was not a question." Lena nodded because denying it felt absurd when they both knew what had displayed on that screen before the machine died. "I need your help," he continued, his voice dropping lower, and Lena found herself leaning in despite every instinct screaming that she should call security or grab Dr. Chen or do literally anything except listen to this man whose wrist held no pulse and whose eyes held the kind of knowledge that came from living too long in shadows. "The security footage," he said. "Every camera in this hospital recorded what just happened, and in 40 minutes that footage uploads automatically to a cloud server, and once it does, I cannot contain it." And Lena's tired brain struggled to understand why footage of a malfunctioning blood pressure cuff would matter enough for the raw urgency bleeding through his careful control. "I have a medical condition," Cassian said, each word chosen with surgical precision. "Genetic, extremely rare. If this footage leaks, my family's privacy ends, and with it our safety," and Lena heard the truth underneath the clinical terminology, heard the thing he was not saying that vibrated in the air between them, like a plucked string. "You want me to delete hospital security footage?" she said flatly, because even exhausted and confused, she understood that what he asked was illegal and dangerous, and would cost her job at minimum, and possibly much worse. "I am asking you to help me protect people who cannot protect themselves," Cassian replied. And then he reached into his jacket again and withdrew a black envelope sealed with red wax that looked old enough to crumble at a touch. The paper felt heavy and strange against her palm when he pressed it into her hand, the texture wrong in a way she could not articulate, too smooth and too rough simultaneously, like something that predated modern manufacturing. "If you help me open this after," he said. "If you refuse, burn it." And the weight of the envelope seemed to increase as he spoke, until it felt like she held something far heavier than paper and wax. The curtain twitched and Dr. Chen's voice called from the other side, asking if everything was all right, and Cassian's hand closed over hers where she gripped the envelope, his fingers ice cold and impossibly strong. "Please," he said, and that single word carried centuries of loneliness and fear, and the particular desperation of someone who had survived by hiding and now faced exposure that would end everything. Lena looked at his face and saw the drowning in his eyes, saw something ancient and terrified, wearing the mask of a man in an expensive suit. And her mouth opened and said yes before her rational mind could intervene. She pocketed the envelope as Dr. Chen pushed through the curtain carrying paperwork and wearing his professional smile. "Mr. Thorne has provided documentation of a rare cardiac condition," he told Lena. "We will schedule outpatient follow-up, but he is free to go," and Cassian stood with a grace that looked choreographed, and thanked the doctor, and turned that drowning gaze back to Lena. "The security office is 3 floors up," he said quietly, while Dr. Chen's attention focused on his tablet. 35 minutes until autosync, and Lena felt the envelope burn against her hip, through the fabric of her scrubs like a promise or a curse as she watched him walk away with footsteps that made no sound on the linoleum and a shadow that seemed too dark for the fluorescent glare. And she knew, with the certainty of someone stepping off a cliff, that her life had just pivoted into something she could not comprehend but could no longer escape. Lena's badge clicked against the card reader with a sound that felt too loud in the empty third-floor corridor, and the lock disengaged with a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo her own resignation as Cassian materialized beside her with that unnerving silence that made her skin prickle, because humans were not supposed to move without the rustle of fabric or the scuff of shoes on tile. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song overhead and cast that particular greenish pall that made everyone look half dead, even in the best of circumstances. And Lena found herself watching Cassian from the corner of her eye as they moved past darkened offices and supply closets, watching how the lights seemed to slide off him rather than illuminate him properly. How his reflection in the glass doors they passed was there but somehow fainter than it should have been, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The stairwell to the administrative level exhaled cold air that made Lena's breath. Fog and small clouds, but Cassian's exhalations produced nothing, no vapor, no sign that warmth existed in his lungs, and she filed that detail away with all the others accumulating in her exhausted mind, like evidence for a trial she did not want to prosecute. They climbed in silence, broken only by the sound of her footsteps, because his made no noise whatsoever on the concrete steps, and when they reached the security office door, they found exactly what Lena had feared. Guard Ramirez parked in his chair with a paperback novel and a thermos of coffee that smelled like burnt rubber and broken dreams. Cassian touched her shoulder, and the cold of his fingers seeped through her scrubs like winter pressing against glass. And he stepped forward with a smile that transformed his face into something charming and apologetic and entirely human. Ramirez looked up and Cassian launched into a story about a celebrity patient in the cardiac wing who needed absolute privacy, and could Ramirez please do a sweep of that floor to ensure no unauthorized personnel were lurking with camera phones. And the guard's face shifted through suspicion to importance to determination in the space of 30 seconds before he grabbed his radio and headed for the stairs with the purposeful stride of someone given a mission. Lena did not wait for Cassian's signal, because they had maybe 5 minutes before Ramirez realized he had been played, and she slipped through the security office door, with her heart hammering hard enough to make her ribs ache. The surveillance console dominated the small room with its bank of monitors showing grainy feeds from every corner of the hospital, emergency exits and parking garages, and the endless corridors where people moved like ghosts through the camera's limited perspective. She found the main terminal, and her fingers remembered their training from the mandatory security briefing all staff endured, navigating through menus to the footage archive where files were stored by timestamp and location. 3:07 a.m., Cubicle 7. The file loaded with agonizing slowness, and Lena's hands hovered over the delete key. because she could end this now, could erase the evidence and walk away, and pretend the last hour had been some exhaustion-induced hallucination. But her thumb moved to the play button instead, and the footage unspooled across the screen in perfect digital clarity. She watched herself enter the frame with the blood pressure cuff, watched Cassian sit motionless on the gurney with that unnatural stillness, watched the monitor's display flicker to 0/0 and then explode in sparks. But the detail that made her stomach drop was not the explosion. It was Cassian's chest, visible in profile through his open suit jacket, the fabric undisturbed by breathing, no rise and fall, no movement whatsoever for the full 3 minutes before the monitor died. She clicked through frame by frame and saw what her exhausted eyes had registered, but her rational mind had dismissed. The way his pupils reflected the overhead lights, with a faint greenish shine, like a cat's eyes catching a flashlight beam. The absolute absence of any fidgeting or shifting or unconscious human movement that marked living bodies. The door whispered open behind her, and Lena spun with a gasp caught in her throat, but Cassian was already there, materializing from nothing, because she had not heard the handle turn or hinges creak or footsteps cross the threshold. "You were not supposed to watch it," he said, and his voice carried a resignation so deep it sounded like grief, like someone who had hoped for a different outcome but always knew disappointment was inevitable. "Now you know," he added, and Lena found herself unable to speak because knowing and seeing were different things, and the footage had transformed abstract impossibility into concrete, undeniable truth. "My family has lived in this city for 300 years, Cassian said into her silence, his eyes fixed on the frozen frame still displayed on the monitor. "We have survived by staying invisible, and tonight I failed, and now you hold our extinction in your hands." And Lena heard the weight of centuries in those words, heard the exhaustion of someone who had been running and hiding for longer than her entire bloodline had existed. She should have been terrified. Every survival instinct should have been screaming at her to run or fight or call for help, but 17 years of nursing had trained her to see suffering before threat, and what she saw in Cassian's ancient eyes was pain worn so smooth by time that it had become part of his foundation. "Are you in pain?" she asked, and the question surprised them both because it was absurd and irrelevant and exactly the thing a nurse would ask when confronted with the impossible. Cassian's expression cracked, and something raw showed through before he controlled it. "No one has asked me that in a century," he said quietly. "Delete the footage and I will answer 3 questions, and then we part ways, and you can return to your life pretending this was a strange dream, brought on by exhaustion." And Lena felt the black envelope pressing against her hip, and knew that pretending was no longer an option. 5 questions, she countered, surprised by her own boldness. "And I want to see your medical records, the real ones." Cassian studied her for a long moment, and then nodded with a small smile that looked genuinely amused. 5 questions, he agreed. "Though I warn you the answers may be more than you want to carry." Lena turned back to the console, and her finger hovered over the delete key, but something made her pause, some instinct honed by years of checking and double-checking, and she noticed the small icon blinking in the corner of the screen, a cloud symbol with an arrow pointing upward. Secondary backup server, automatic upload, the kind of redundancy IT departments loved, and people trying to hide impossible footage feared. She clicked delete. Anyway, because the deal was made and the primary file dissolved into digital nothing. "What are you?" she asked, using her first question like ripping off a bandage, and Cassian's answer came without hesitation. "A vampire king," he said. "The last of my line to hold a throne, even if that throne is now a corporate boardroom and my subjects are investors and employees who have no idea what signs their paychecks." The words hung in the air between them for 3 heartbeats, and then alarms erupted throughout the building. A shrieking wail that made Lena flinch and Cassian's jaw tighten. "The IT system detected the deletion," he said, already moving toward the door. "Security will be here in seconds," and his hand closed around hers, with that ice-cold grip that felt like bones wrapped in frozen silk, and he pulled her into the corridor at a speed that made her stumble. They ran through service corridors Lena barely knew existed, and Cassian moved with inhuman swiftness, his strides eating distance while she struggled to keep pace, her lungs burning and legs aching. A locked door blocked their path, and Cassian did not slow, just reached out and tore the handle completely free with a screech of metal that sounded like something dying, the entire doorframe splintering under force that should have been impossible. "The morgue," he said, steering her through rooms she recognized from the hospital's basement level. Fewer cameras down here, and Lena's mind noted the disturbing practicality of his knowledge as they emerged into the cold, sterile space where bodies waited for processing. A gurney sat against one wall with a sheet-covered form, and the fabric had slipped enough to show pale skin and absolute stillness. No breath, no warmth, just the terrible inert quality of flesh that no longer housed life. Just like Cassian, they burst through the loading dock exit into air that tasted like freedom and exhaust fumes, and a black car waited with engine running, and a man behind the wheel whose face showed no surprise at their disheveled appearance. "Victor," Cassian said by way of introduction as he ushered Lena into the back seat. "My aide and the only person in my organization who knows what I am." The car pulled away from the curb with smooth acceleration, and Lena watched the hospital recede through the rear window. Watched the place she had worked for 8 years become something foreign and strange. "Why risk exposure at a hospital?" she asked, spending her second question, because she needed to understand what could drive someone who had hidden for centuries to gamble everything on a single night. "Someone I trusted was treated there tonight," Cassian answered, his gaze distant. "Poisoned. I needed to know who brought him in and what they know about us because vampire politics are complicated and ancient, and a single breach in secrecy can cascade into war." The car turned onto the main boulevard, and Thorn Tower rose ahead of them, 40 stories of sleek glass and steel that reflected the city lights like a mirror holding 1,000 captured stars. They entered through a private garage and a private elevator that required Cassian's palm print and carried them upward with the smooth inevitability of fate. The penthouse office was a study in contrasts, antique furniture that looked older than the country sharing space with computer monitors and modern telecommunications equipment, oil paintings in ornate frames hanging above minimalist glass desks. Lena felt dislocated in time, unable to reconcile the different centuries colliding in this single space. Victor appeared carrying a tablet, and his face held the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. "The backup footage uploaded to the cloud before she deleted the primary file," he said without preamble. "It has already been flagged by an external party, and we are attempting to trace the access, but preliminary analysis suggests vampire hunters." And Lena felt the floor drop out from under her understanding, because apparently deleting the file had bought them nothing but minutes and the illusion of safety, while the real threat had already escaped into networks she could not touch and consequences she could not imagine. The ancient document lay spread across Cassian's mahogany desk like an accusation written in faded ink and the weight of centuries. The parchment so old it seemed to exhale dust when Victor carefully unrolled it under the penthouse lights. Lena leaned forward despite herself and saw handwriting in languages she could not read, ornate calligraphy interspersed with seals pressed deep into wax that had hardened into something closer to stone than organic material. "The Nightfall Accords," Cassian said, his finger tracing a line of text near the bottom where signatures clustered in a way that suggested desperation and compromise. "Signed in 1742 between the major vampire houses and human governments who knew the truth but valued stability over revelation." Lena's eyes tracked across the document and caught fragments that had been translated into English in careful annotations along the margins, words like covenant and concealment and consequences that made her pulse quicken. The terms are simple, Cashin continued, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone reciting a death sentence they had memorized long ago. Vampires may exist in secret among human populations, provided we maintain absolute discretion and harm no one without severe provocation, and in return, human authorities agree to neither hunt us nor expose us to the general population. His finger moved to a section marked with a red seal that looked like dried blood. But exposure triggers what they call the reckoning protocol, he said. Specialized hunter units, some human and some vampire, are authorized to eliminate any individual or house whose secrecy has been compromised to prevent mass panic and the collapse of social order. Lena felt her mouth go dry because the clinical language barely masked the violence underneath, the promise of execution dressed up in diplomatic terminology. How many vampires live under these accords, she asked, though she was not sure if this counted as one of her 5 questions or just a clarification. Cashin glanced at Victor, who answered in a voice like gravel sliding down glass. Approximately 4,000 in North America alone, he said, divided among 7 major houses and dozens of minor bloodlines, all of whom have survived for generations, by adhering to the rules your people wrote. The tablet in Victor's hand chimed, and his expression shifted from neutral to grim in the space between heartbeats. The Conclave has accessed the backup footage, he said. They have issued an ultimatum. Cassian's jaw tightened, but he did not look surprised, just resigned, and Lena recognized that expression from patients who had known their diagnosis before the doctor confirmed it. What are the terms? Cassian asked, and Victor turned the tablet so they could both see the message displayed in stark white text against a black background. 72 hours to contain the breach and eliminate all evidence and witnesses or forfeit your throne and your life to conclave justice, Victor read aloud. The message is signed by all 6 remaining houses. They are unanimous. Lena's brain stuttered over the word witnesses because she understood with sudden cold clarity that witness meant her, that she had become a problem requiring elimination, that her decision to help had transformed her from bystander to target. Why do you need a throne if you are hiding? She asked, using her third question, because understanding felt more important than fear in this moment. Cassian turned to face her fully, and something in his expression looked almost grateful for the question. The throne is not ceremonial, he said. It is a binding, a magical and political construct that holds treaties and wards and truces between vampire houses who would otherwise tear this city apart in their competition for territory and resources. My bloodline inherited this binding 4 centuries ago, and it requires a living heir to maintain it. If I fall, the binding dissolves, and 7 houses currently held in careful balance will go to war for dominance. Lena tried to process the implications of gang warfare conducted by immortal predators with superhuman strength and centuries of grudges to settle. How many people would die, she asked, though this question fell outside her allotted 5, and Cashin answered anyway. Thousands, he said flatly. Vampires feed, and when we are at war, we feed without discretion or care, and the bodies pile up faster than human authorities can explain them away as serial killers or disease outbreaks. The elevator chimed, and Lena's head snapped toward the sound, because no one should have had access to this floor without clearance. Victor's hand moved to something under his jacket, but Cassian held up one finger in a gesture that communicated, "Wait and watch." The elevator doors opened, and a woman stepped into the penthouse with the kind of presence that made the space feel smaller, her movements precise and controlled, her clothing elegant in a way that suggested wealth so old it no longer needed to prove itself. She appeared perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back in a style that belonged to a different century, and eyes that assessed Lena with the cold calculation of someone evaluating livestock. Seraphine Voss, Cassian said, and his voice held layers of history and politics that Lena could not untangle. To what do I owe the pleasure of a personal visit from the Conclave's enforcer? Seraphine's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. The pleasure is entirely mine, Cassian. though I suspect you know why I am here." Her gaze slid to Lena and lingered with an expression that made Lena's skin crawl. "The human nurse is a liability," she said, her tone conversational and pleasant, and absolutely inflexible. "Eliminate her, or we eliminate you both and install someone more pragmatic on your throne." Cashin moved, and suddenly he was standing between Lena and Seraphine, his body a barrier that looked deceptively relaxed, but thrummed with tension Lena could feel from 3 feet away. "She is under my protection," he said. "The Accords grant me that right as sovereign of this territory. Any harm done to her is harm done to my house, and will be answered accordingly." Seraphine's smile widened, and Lena saw fangs longer and sharper than she had imagined, saw the thing that lived underneath the elegant veneer. "Then you have chosen death," Seraphine said, with something like satisfaction warming her voice. "The Conclave predicted you would make this mistake because you have always been too sentimental about humans, too willing to see them as equals rather than resources." She moved closer, and Cassian held his ground, but Lena noticed his hands were trembling slightly, noticed a sheen of something like sweat on his forehead despite the climate-controlled air. "Your binding is already weakening," Seraphine continued, her eyes tracking details invisible to Lena. "I can smell the deterioration in your blood, can see the way your power frays at the edges. How long has it been since you fed properly, since you took enough to sustain a king, rather than sipping at the margins like some newly turned fledgling afraid of his own nature?" Lena's eyes were drawn to the windows where rain had begun to streak the glass in patterns that caught the city lights, and there in the reflection she saw something that made her breath stop. Cassian's image appeared in the rain-wet window, faint but visible, his outline wavering like something only partially anchored to the physical world. Vampire reflections were supposed to be absent, or at least that was what the folklore claimed, but apparently the folklore was wrong, or perhaps the rules changed when a vampire's power began to fail. Seraphine saw Lena's gaze shift and followed it to the window, saw the reflection that should not exist, and her expression transformed into triumph. "There it is," she said softly, "the proof of your decline. When was the last time you appeared in mirrors, Cassian? When did your reflection start to return as your immortality unravels?" Cassian said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough, and Lena understood with sick certainty that she was watching something ancient and powerful come undone. "You have 72 hours, Seraphine said, pulling a phone from her pocket and taking a photograph of Cassian's reflection in the window with casual cruelty. "I will return at the end of that period to collect either proof of containment or your head to present to the conclave." She turned toward the elevator and paused with her hand on the door. "For what it is worth," she added without looking back, "I hope you choose survival over sentiment. You were a decent king while you lasted." The elevator doors closed, and silence filled the penthouse, like water rushing into a sinking ship. Lena found her voice after several seconds of nothing but the sound of rain against glass. "Your reflection," she said. "What does it mean?" Cassian moved to the window and pressed his palm against the glass, studying his own faint outline with an expression Lena could not read. "It means I am dying," he said simply. "Vampires do not age, but we can deteriorate if we deny our nature too long, if we refuse to feed properly in a misguided attempt to be more human than monster. My reflection returning is a sign that my immortality is failing, that I am becoming mortal again in the slowest and most painful way possible." "How long?" Lena asked. "Months, perhaps," Cassian replied. "Maybe less if the stress accelerates the decline. The binding I hold requires strength I no longer possess, and when it breaks, the war Seraphine wants will come regardless of what the conclave decides about my fate." Victor cleared his throat from where he stood near the desk. "We need a plan," he said. 72 hours is not enough time to contain footage that has already spread to Conclave servers and Hunter networks, but it might be enough time to negotiate or flee, or find some third option no one has considered. Cassian turned from the window and looked at Lena with eyes that held too much weariness for one lifetime, let alone several centuries. "You should go," he said. "Return to your life, and forget this night, and in 72 hours when they come for me, you will be safely distant and uninvolved." But Lena thought about the black envelope still pressed against her hip, thought about the footage that showed a man with no heartbeat and a chest that never moved, thought about the binding that held back a war, and the reflection that proved even immortals could break. She had 4 questions left, and 72 hours to understand what she had stumbled into, and the strange certainty that walking away would be the safer choice, but not the right one. "I am already involved," she said. "Tell me how to help you survive this." The windows of Thorn Tower became eyes watching from the darkness, and Lena stood 3 feet back from the glass, because Victor had warned her that sniper rifles existed, and some vampires had excellent aim, even at impossible distances. She had not been home in 18 hours, and her phone showed 47 missed calls from her supervisor at the hospital, and a termination notice, effective immediately for abandonment of shift, and she felt the life she had built over 8 years crumbling like sand through fingers she could not close fast enough. Cassian sat at his desk reviewing documents with the methodical focus of someone using work to avoid thinking about their own mortality, and Lena watched the way his hands trembled slightly when he turned pages, watched exhaustion settle into the lines around his eyes like sediment accumulating over centuries. "What happens if you lose your throne?" she asked, spending her 4th question because understanding the stakes felt essential to deciding whether she was helping or enabling. Cassian looked up, and his expression carried the weight of someone who had calculated this outcome many times. "The wards I maintain collapse," he said. "Protections woven into the city's infrastructure that keep rogue vampires contained and regulated. Without those wards, the older ones will flood in, vampires who remember when humans were cattle and cities were hunting grounds, vampires who never accepted the accords and only tolerate them because my binding makes violation too costly." Lena's mouth went dry. "How many?" she asked, and Cassian's pause told her the answer before he spoke. "Hundreds, perhaps," he said. "Maybe more depending on how quickly word spreads that the territory is undefended. Humans will become prey again, and the death toll will climb faster than authorities can respond, because rogue vampires do not leave bodies that look like natural deaths or explainable murders." Lena moved to the chair across from his desk and sat because her legs felt unreliable. She studied Cassian's face and saw past the careful control to the exhaustion underneath, saw someone running on fumes and willpower and the fading remnants of power that no longer sustained him. "When did you last feed?" she asked, though this fell outside her question allotment and touched on something intimate in ways she did not fully understand. Cassian's smile was bitter and self-aware. "3 weeks ago," he said. "Synthetic blood from a medical supply company I own. It sustains basic function but lacks the vital essence that real feeding provides." Lena thought about blood bags in hospital storage, thought about the difference between saline and plasma, thought about how substitutes never quite match the original. "Why not feed properly?" she asked. "Because feeding properly means hunting, and hunting means choosing a victim, and I am tired of making those choices," Cassian said, his voice dropping to something raw and unguarded. "I am tired of surviving at the cost of others. I am tired of being a king and holding thrones and maintaining bindings that require me to be something I no longer want to be. But I will not let innocence pay for my mistakes or my exhaustion." The elevator chimed and Lena tensed, but Cassian held up a calming hand. "That will be Elias," he said. "I called him hours ago." The doors opened and a figure emerged who looked like he might crumble to dust if someone breathed too hard in his direction. A man so old his skin seemed translucent, and his movements carried the careful deliberation of someone conserving limited energy. But his eyes were sharp and calculating, and when they fixed on Lena, she felt assessed and catalogued, and understood in ways that made her uncomfortable. "Dr. Elias Crane," the man said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his fragile appearance. Vampire historian and Cassian's former tutor back when he was newly turned and did not understand the political landscape he had inherited. He moved to the desk and lowered himself into a chair with visible relief. "I hear you have gotten yourself into spectacular trouble," he said to Cassian, with something like fondness warming his tone. Cassian summarized the situation in clipped sentences, while Elias listened with the focus of someone solving a complex equation. When Cassian finished, Elias sat in silence for several seconds before nodding. "Invoke the right of clemency," he said. "Bind the human as your ward under the accords. The conclave cannot touch her without breaking the treaty and starting a war none of the houses can afford." Lena looked between them, trying to parse the meaning behind unfamiliar terminology. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked. Elias turned his sharp gaze to her. "It means a blood exchange," he said. "A ritual that marks you as under Cassian's protection and ties your fate to his in ways both symbolic and literal. You would carry a trace of his essence and gain partial immunity to vampire compulsion and be recognized by all who understand the old laws as untouchable. But you would also be hunted by his enemies, who would see you as a weakness to exploit, and you would be bound to him for life, or until he releases you, which given his current trajectory may not be particularly long." The casual assessment of Cassian's impending death landed with brutal honesty, and Lena saw Cassian flinch slightly before his mask slid back into place. "What are the risks to me?" Lena asked. Elias smiled without humor. "Death if his enemies catch you," he said. "Transformation if you are injured badly enough that his essence activates to save your life. Political entanglement in vampire affairs that will make your previous human existence impossible to return to." Lena sat with this information and felt the weight of the choice pressing against her ribs like something physical. Every instinct screamed that she should run, should take her chances with witness protection or disappearing to another city, or literally anything except binding herself magically to a dying vampire king. But she thought about the footage going viral, thought about rogues flooding the city, thought about Cassian's weary admission that he was tired but unwilling to let innocents suffer. "I agree," she said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff with no certainty of landing. Cassian's expression cycled through surprise and gratitude and concern. "You do not have to do this," he said. "We can find another way." But Elias was already standing and gesturing toward the door at the back of the penthouse. "There is no other way, and she knows it," he said. "Let us proceed before the conclave sends someone more aggressive than Seraphine." Cassian led them through a door Lena had not noticed into a chamber that felt like stepping back in time. Stone walls and candle sconces and furniture that belonged in a medieval castle rather than a modern skyscraper. Elias moved around the space, lighting candles with steady hands, while Cassian stood in the center looking like a man preparing for surgery he knew would hurt. "The ritual requires candlelight and intention and blood freely given," Elias explained as he arranged items on a small table. "Silver blade for the cutting, bowl to catch the excess, words in the old tongue to seal the binding." Lena's nursing training made her want to ask about sterile technique and infection risk, but she understood dimly that magic operated on different rules than medicine. Cassian picked up the silver blade, and Lena saw his hand recoil slightly from the metal before he forced himself to grip it properly. He pressed the edge to his palm and drew it across in one smooth motion, and Lena saw the way the silver burned his skin, saw smoke rise from the wound before blood followed, darker than human blood, and moving with strange viscosity. He held his bleeding palm over the bowl and then offered the blade to Lena. She took it with trembling fingers and mimicked his motion, gasping at the sharp pain but forcing herself to complete the cut. Her blood dripped red and normal and utterly human into the bowl, where it mixed with his in patterns that seemed to move with purpose. Cassian reached for her hand, and their palms met, blood mingling in the space between flesh. And Lena felt something surge through her like electricity and memory, and drowning all at once. Images flooded her mind in overwhelming cascade. Cassian as a young man in clothing from a different century, confused and terrified as he woke in a crypt, with fangs and hunger. Decades of learning to navigate vampire politics, of making alliances and enemies, of holding a throne he never wanted because the alternative was war. Faces of people he had loved, had fed from, had failed to save. The weight of 300 years pressing down on him like ocean depth. Loneliness so profound it had become background noise. And underneath it all, a desperate hope that he could be something better than his nature demanded. Lena gasped and would have fallen, but Cassian's free hand caught her elbow and steadied her. "The memories are temporary," he said quietly. "Side effect of the binding. They will fade." But Lena was still drowning in his past when Elias spoke words in a language that sounded like Latin, mixed with something older and wronger, and the air in the chambers seemed to thicken. Heat bloomed where their palms touched and then faded to a dull ache. When Cassian released her hand, Lena saw a mark on her wrist. A silver sigil like a tattoo, but raised slightly from the skin and warm to the touch. "Done," Elias said with satisfaction. "She is warded now under the old laws." The door slammed open, and Victor burst in with his phone in hand and panic in his eyes. "The hospital footage went viral," he said. "Posted on a conspiracy forum 2 hours ago and picked up by mainstream aggregators. It will be on major news outlets within the hour. Facial recognition software is working to identify Cassian. The breach is public now." Lena felt the floor tilt because going public meant no containing this. Meant exposure on a scale that would force the conclave's hand and trigger consequences none of them could predict. Cassian's jaw tightened, and he looked at Elias, who nodded slowly. "You need to control the narrative before it controls you," Elias said. "Go public partially. Claim a medical condition. Use your resources to fabricate credibility." Cassian turned to Lena. "I need you to corroborate my story," he said. "Stand beside me as my treating nurse and back the narrative that this is a rare genetic disorder with experimental treatment protocols." Lena thought about lying on camera, thought about her nursing license already in jeopardy, thought about becoming complicit in a cover-up that would either save thousands or destroy her credibility forever. What choice did she have when the alternative was war? Within 3 hours, they stood in the lobby of Thorn Tower, surrounded by cameras and reporters, and the hot glare of lights that made Lena's eyes water. Cassian wore a tailored suit that made him look like every inch the successful CEO, and he exuded calm authority as he approached the podium with Lena one step behind. He spoke about a rare genetic condition that had been in his family for generations, about experimental gene therapy that explained the unusual vital signs, about doctor-patient confidentiality and media sensationalism that had blown a private medical matter into conspiracy fodder. His voice was smooth and reasonable, and Lena watched reporters nod along because people wanted rational explanations more than they wanted truth. When they turned questions to Lena, her heart hammered so hard she felt it in her throat, but she forced herself to speak steadily about unusual presentations and medical anomalies, and the importance of not jumping to supernatural conclusions. She was convincing because she was genuinely terrified, but not of Cassian, not anymore. She terrified of failing him, of saying the wrong thing and watching this fragile house of cards collapse. The questions were winding down when movement erupted at the back of the room and a figure rushed forward too fast for security to intercept. Lena saw the blade in his hand, saw the silver gleam under the lights, saw him lunging toward her with inhuman speed. Cassian moved faster, and suddenly he was between her and the attacker, and the blade that should have buried in Lena's chest buried in Cassian's shoulder instead. On camera, in front of 50 reporters, Cassian staggered but did not fall, and when he pulled the blade free, blood followed. Not red, but black as ink, dark as old oil, impossible and undeniable. The feed cut. Someone screamed. Chaos erupted as security tackled the attacker, and reporters surged forward shouting questions, and Lena grabbed Cassian's arm to steady him and felt his blood soaking through his shirt warm and wrong. The world just saw something impossible, and there was no explaining this away. The cathedral existed in a space the city had forgotten, buried 3 levels beneath old subway tunnels, in architecture that predated electric light by centuries. Lena descended stone stairs worn smooth by countless feet, and felt the temperature drop with each step until her breath misted in the air and goosebumps rose along her arms. Gothic arches soared overhead, disappearing into shadows that candles could not penetrate, and stained glass windows depicted scenes she did not recognize at first. Images of figures with elongated fangs and crimson eyes presiding over gatherings that looked like coronations or executions or both. Cassian walked beside her with Victor 1 step behind, and his posture carried the rigid formality of someone entering enemy territory under a flag of truce. The conclave sat in a semicircle of ornate chairs that looked like thrones, 6 vampires representing the major houses, each one radiating power that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. Seraphine occupied the center position, and her smile, when she saw Cassian, was triumphant and cold. Lena recognized 2 others from photographs Victor had shown her during the frantic preparation. Lord Matthias, who appeared as a severe man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and had actually walked the earth for 800 years, and Lady Ashara, who looked barely 20, but whose eyes held the calculation of someone who had seen empires rise and fall. The trial began without preamble. Seraphine stood and addressed the assembly with the practiced ease of someone who had prepared this speech for weeks. Cassian Thorne stands accused of reckless exposure that threatens the Nightfall Accords and endangers every vampire under their protection, she said. His carelessness led to footage of his nature being broadcast to millions. His weakness in protecting a human nurse above the security of our kind demonstrates unfitness to hold the throne and the binding it requires. I call for his immediate abdication and execution under the Reckoning Protocol. Murmurs rippled through the council, and Lena felt Cassian tense beside her, though his expression remained neutral. Lord Matthias spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Cassian has kept the peace in this territory for 6 decades, he said. His binding has prevented conflicts that would have cost us far more than 1 leaked video. We should not be hasty in removing a proven leader. But Lady Ashara countered with clinical precision. Proven leaders adapt to changing circumstances, she said. The modern world has surveillance technology our founders never imagined. A king who cannot navigate that reality is a liability regardless of past successes. The debate continued, and Lena watched Cassian's jaw tighten incrementally with each accusation. During a brief recess when council members withdrew to confer privately, Lena leaned close and whispered her 5th and final question. Why do not you just tell them the truth, she asked, that you were trying to protect someone? Cassian's eyes met hers, and she saw pain flash across his expression before he controlled it. Because the vampire I was protecting is my brother Lucien, he said quietly. He has been secretly feeding on humans again in violation of the Accords. If the Conclave learns this, they will execute him along with me, and I cannot let that happen. Lena processed this new information, feeling pieces click into place. The hospital visit was not about you at all, she said. Cassian shook his head. Lucien was poisoned, he said. A toxin designed to mimic the effects of silver exposure, but slower and more insidious. I brought him to the hospital because I needed access to equipment that could analyze his blood without raising vampire suspicions. I was trying to trace the poison back to whoever deployed it so I could stop them before they killed him. The council reconvened, and Cassian stood with the kind of calm that came from having made a decision. Before we proceed to judgment, I have evidence the council should review, he said. Victor stepped forward with a tablet and projected documents onto the cathedral wall, emails and financial transfers, and surveillance footage that painted a damning picture. Communications between Seraphine and members of House Draven showing coordination on the timing of Lucien's poisoning and the media leak. Payments to the conspiracy forum that first posted the hospital footage. Plans to install Seraphine on Cassian's throne once he was removed. The conclave erupted into chaos with council members shouting over each other and Seraphine's expression transforming from triumph to cold fury. She did not deny the accusations. Instead, she rose, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. "I do not deny orchestrating Cassian's downfall," she said, "because he is weak, too sympathetic to humans, too willing to compromise the old ways in pursuit of peace that makes us soft. Look at him standing there defending a human nurse, while our kind grows weaker with each generation that refuses to feed properly. I offer strength where he offers accommodation. I offer a return to the power we once wielded, instead of hiding in shadows and pretending we are something we are not." Lord Matthias stood, and his presence commanded silence. "The evidence of conspiracy is clear," he said, "but Seraphine raises valid concerns about leadership philosophy. Ancient law permits trial by combat in cases where evidence conflicts with ideology. Cassian, you have the right to challenge your accuser for your throne and your life. Do you accept?" Cassian's pause lasted only seconds, but Lena felt the weight of it, felt him calculating odds and consequences. "I accept," he said. The cathedral's center cleared as vampires moved to the perimeter, forming a circle around a space marked with symbols carved into the stone floor. Seraphine removed her jacket with deliberate slowness, revealing arms corded with muscle that should not exist on her frame. She moved to the circle's edge, and her smile was all predator. "I am going to enjoy this," she said. Cassian stepped into the circle, and Lena saw the way he favored his left side, saw the silver wound in his shoulder still not healed, saw exhaustion in every line of his body. Victor handed him a blade and retreated to stand beside Lena. "He is going to lose," Lena whispered, and Victor's silence was confirmation. The fight began with Seraphine's first strike, and Lena barely saw her move, just the blur of motion and the sound of impact as Cassian blocked and stumbled back. Seraphine was faster and stronger, and 600 years of combat experience showed in every calculated attack. Cassian fought defensively using strategy over strength, redirecting blows instead of meeting them head-on, looking for openings that never quite appeared. Blood bloomed on his shirt from the shoulder wound reopening, and Lena saw him slowing down. She forced herself to look away from the fight and study the cathedral's architecture, the wards carved into pillars and arches, symbols she did not recognize but that hummed with latent power. She moved to where Elias stood, watching with grave concern. "The wards," she said. "Can Cassian activate them?" Elias glanced at her sharply. "Only if he accepts his full nature," he said. "The wards amplify the reigning king's power, but require him to embrace what he is completely. Cassian has been suppressing his vampire strength for years, trying to remain partially human. He would need to let that go." In the circle, Cassian went down on one knee, as Seraphine's kick connected with his ribs. She circled him like a cat playing with wounded prey. "Yield," she said. "I will make your death quick." Cassian looked up, and his eyes found Lena across the cathedral. She saw the question in his gaze, saw him weighing what he would have to become to survive this. Lena thought about the memories she had seen during the blood. Right. Thought about 300 years of loneliness and trying to be better than his nature demanded. She nodded once. Cassian closed his eyes, and something shifted in the air like pressure dropping before a storm. When he opened them again, they burned crimson, not the pale red she had seen before, but deep scarlet like fresh blood in sunlight. The wards carved into the cathedral ignited with dark light that cast shadows in impossible directions. Cassian rose to his feet and moved with speed that made Seraphine's earlier attacks look sluggish. He was on her before she could react, blade at her throat, his other hand gripping her wrist in a hold that made her drop her weapon. The cathedral fell silent, except for Seraphine's ragged breathing. "Yield," Cassian said, and his voice carried harmonics that vibrated in Lena's chest. Seraphine's eyes widened with something that might have been fear or respect. "I yield," she said. Cassian could have killed her. Ancient law permitted it. The conclave expected it. Instead, he released her and stepped back. "You are exiled from this territory," he said. "Take whatever followers remain loyal and leave by dawn. If you return, I will not show mercy twice." Seraphine stared at him and slowly nodded. She collected her jacket and walked toward the cathedral exit with her head high. The gesture of mercy rippled through the assembled vampires like a shock wave. Lord Matthias spoke into the silence. "The throne remains House Thorn," he said. "This council is adjourned." Dawn was breaking when Lena and Cassian stood on the rooftop of Thorn Tower, watching light creep across the city skyline. Exhaustion pulled at Lena like a physical weight, but she felt too wired to sleep, too full of adrenaline and relief, and the strange intimacy of having witnessed someone completely transform themselves. "Lucian is recovering," Cassian said without looking at her. "Victor found the source of the poison and eliminated the threat. The media storm is contained. The black blood footage was successfully debunked as a hoax using CGI experts I keep on retainer for exactly these situations." Lena absorbed this information and felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. "So it is over," she said. Cassian's silence made her look at him. "Not quite," he said. "The fight with Seraphine forced me to accept my full nature, and I can feel the binding settling back into place properly for the first time in months. But there are consequences to what we have done." His expression was unreadable in the dawn light. "I have lived 347 years alone," he said. "I forgot what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, until you took my blood pressure in that hospital room and did not look away when you should have." Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she could not say why. "I am still terrified of you," she admitted. "Good," Cassian said with something like warmth in his voice. "You should be. The blood right means we are connected now, and that bond does not break easily. You will age and I will not, and eventually that difference will become impossible to ignore. I can release you from the binding if you want your life back." Lena thought about her apartment under surveillance, thought about her terminated nursing position, thought about the mark on her wrist and the memories of centuries she had glimpsed. She thought about Cassian standing between her and a blade, about choosing mercy when violence would have been easier. "Someone has to keep you from exploding any more hospital equipment," she said. Cassian's laugh was surprised and genuine. Victor emerged from the rooftop access with his phone in hand, and concern etched across his features. "We have a problem," he said. 3 rogue vampires vanished from the city's underground network last night. Surveillance shows them heading north toward a town called Millbrook that has no vampire presence and no protections. Cassian's entire posture shifted, relaxation replaced by battle-ready tension. "It is starting," he said quietly. Lena looked between them, trying to parse the significance. "What is starting?" she asked. "The war I have been holding back for a century," Cassian said. "Seraphine's exile will embolden other rogues who see the Accords as weakness. They will test the boundaries, and if I do not respond, they will push further until everything collapses." Victor pulled up a map showing Millbrook's location 200 miles north, a small town of maybe 8,000 people with nothing to defend against predators they did not believe existed. "We leave in an hour," Cassian said. Lena felt exhaustion and fear war with something else, something that felt dangerously like purpose. "I am coming with you," she said. Cassian started to protest, but she cut him off. You bound me as your ward, which means where you go, I go according to the accords you explained. Besides, you need someone who can treat injuries, and I doubt you have a lot of trauma surgeons in your inner circle. Cassian looked at her for a long moment and then nodded. Victor, get the team ready, he said. We have a war to prevent. 1 month passed in the way time moved after everything changed, each day feeling simultaneously eternal and fleeting, as Lena adjusted to a reality where monsters were real, and she had somehow become the person who stood between them and innocent people who still believed the world made sense. She returned to St. Mercy Hospital, not to her old position in the emergency department where her termination remained on record, but to a newly created role in patient advocacy that came with a private office and salary that made her previous nursing income look insulting, and everyone knew, without saying, that the funding came from Thorne Medical Enterprises. She worked her shifts monitoring patient intake records and incident reports, looking for patterns that might indicate vampire involvement. Unusual deaths where the body showed signs of extreme blood loss, but no obvious wounds, blood bank. Shortages that could not be explained by normal usage rates, patients admitted with symptoms that defied medical explanation. Her phone connected directly to Victor, who had become something like a friend in the strange way people bonded when they shared secrets that could get them killed. And twice a week she met with Cassian in his office at Thorn Tower to review cases and coordinate responses. The trip to Millbrook had ended without the war Cassian feared, though 3 rogue vampires were now permanently eliminated, and the town never knew how close it came to becoming a hunting ground. Lena discovered she had a talent for this work, for seeing connections between disparate incidents and asking questions that revealed hidden patterns. She learned to recognize the signs of vampire feeding that could be mistaken for drug overdoses or animal attacks, learned which hospital staff could be trusted with partial truth and which needed to be kept completely ignorant. Dr. Reeves suspected something, but never asked directly, and Lena was grateful for his willingness to look the other way when she requisitioned supplies that had no obvious medical application. Elias visited the hospital twice to teach her about vampire physiology and how to defend herself. Lessons conducted in the morgue after hours, where privacy was guaranteed and the cold kept her alert. He showed her how to use silver-infused syringes that could incapacitate a vampire long enough to escape, where to strike to cause maximum damage, how to recognize the signs that a vampire was about to lose control. You have become valuable, Elias said during their last session, and valuable things attract danger. Cassian trusts you, which makes you a target for anyone who wants to hurt him. Lena absorbed this warning and added a silver knife to her bag next to her stethoscope. Her apartment was no longer under surveillance, though she moved anyway to a building with better security and sightlines that Victor personally approved. Her old life felt like something that happened to someone else. The Lena who complained about double shifts and dreamed of eventually becoming a nurse practitioner seemed impossibly naive now. She had found purpose beyond exhaustion, had become something she did not have words for yet, a bridge between the daylight world of medicine and the shadow world of vampire politics. Some nights, she lay awake wondering if she had made a terrible mistake binding herself to Cassian and his endless war, wondering if the mark on her wrist was a brand or a promise. Other nights, she remembered the way Cassian had stood between her and a blade, remembered his admission that he was tired of surviving alone, remembered the weight of his memories flooding through her during the blood rite. She was not sure if what she felt qualified as trust, but it was something close, something like partnership built on mutual need and grudging respect. Cassian had changed too in ways both obvious and subtle. He fed properly now, though still refused to hunt humans, and instead maintained arrangements with willing donors who understood what they were offering and received generous compensation. His power stabilized, and the exhaustion that had pulled at him during those first desperate days faded into something more manageable. He smiled more, laughed at Victor's dry observations, admitted when he did not have answers instead of pretending omniscience. He learned to let Lena share the burden of watching for threats, learned that accepting help did not mean weakness. They fell into rhythms that felt almost domestic, despite the strangeness of their situation. Coffee meetings that turned into strategy sessions, late-night phone calls when one of them could not sleep, the comfortable silence of two people who had seen each other at their worst and chose to stay anyway. Lord Matthias visited once to assess how Cassian was managing post-trial, and spent an hour interrogating Lena about her intentions and capabilities before declaring her acceptable, which she chose to take as a compliment. The conclave maintained uneasy peace, though everyone knew Seraphine's exile had created power vacuums that other ambitious vampires would try to fill. 3 minor skirmishes broke out in territories adjacent to Cassian's, but he handled them with efficiency that reminded Lena he had been doing this for decades before she stumbled into his world. She accompanied him twice more on interventions, once to a nightclub where a young vampire was losing control and feeding too aggressively, once to a warehouse where smugglers were trading vampire blood on the black market. Both situations resolved without human casualties, though Lena had to use her silver syringe during the warehouse raid, and the vampire's scream when the metal entered his bloodstream would haunt her dreams for weeks. Cassian held her afterwards while she shook, his arms solid and cool around her shoulders, his voice low and steady as he reminded her that she had saved lives by acting quickly. "You are stronger than you think," he said, and Lena wanted desperately to believe him. Her co-workers noticed changes, though they attributed them to stress, or perhaps a new relationship, which was not entirely wrong. She moved with more confidence, spoke with more authority, no longer apologized for taking up space. Patients responded to this shift, and her satisfaction scores climbed, though she suspected some of that came from the fact that she now had time to actually listen instead of rushing between emergencies. She made friends with the night shift security guard Marcus, who had worked at St. Mercy for 15 years and noticed things other people missed, and he became an unofficial early warning system for unusual activity. The hospital felt different now that she knew what to look for. Every shadow potentially hiding something dangerous, every unexplained death potentially supernatural. But instead of making her paranoid, this knowledge made her feel prepared, like she had finally learned rules to a game everyone else was playing blind. She kept a go bag in her office with medical supplies and weapons, kept her phone charged and volume high, kept her skills sharp through practice sessions with Elias, who approved of her dedication even as he warned her not to become overconfident. "Overconfidence kills," he said. "The vampires who survive centuries are the ones who never stop being afraid." Tonight marked exactly 30 days since the conclave trial, and Lena worked a regular shift that felt beautifully mundane after weeks of chaos. She took blood pressures and administered medications and charted vital signs with the methodical focus of someone grateful for routine. A patient in room 4 needed reassurance about his upcoming surgery, and she sat with him for 20 minutes explaining the procedure until his anxiety visibly decreased. A teenager in room 7 had a skateboarding injury that required stitches, and Lena worked carefully to minimize scarring while the girl's mother hovered with worried questions. The emergency department hummed with normal human crisis, heart attacks and broken bones and asthma attacks, problems that had solutions she understood. She finished her documentation and moved to the nurses' station where the equipment waited for the next patient. The blood pressure machine sat on its cart exactly where it belonged, and Lena felt a flicker of amusement, remembering how this whole impossible journey started with a machine that could not handle Cassian's non-existent vital signs. She wrapped the cuff around a patient's arm, pressed the button, watched the numbers climb and fall in expected patterns. The machine worked perfectly. She smiled. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out, expecting a message from Victor about scheduling their weekly meeting. Instead, Cassian's name lit the screen. 3 rogues spotted in the ER, the text read. "I am on my way." Lena felt her pulse spike as she scanned the emergency department with new eyes. The waiting room was moderately full, maybe 20 people in various states of injury or illness, nothing that screamed vampire at first glance. But then she saw them, 3 men sitting separately, but watching each other with the kind of coordination that suggested pack behavior, all wearing sunglasses despite the fluorescent lighting, all unnaturally still in the way vampires forgot to mimic human fidgeting. One was bleeding from a head wound that should have been gushing but only oozed dark liquid. Another had his arm in a makeshift sling but held it at an angle that suggested the bone was already healing faster than human physiology allowed. The third simply watched the triage nurse with an intensity that made Lena's skin crawl. She pocketed her phone and moved to her office with deliberate casualness, grabbed the silver-infused syringe from her go-bag, and slipped it into her scrub pocket where it rested heavy and reassuring. She grabbed 2 more syringes as backup and a vial of sedative that Elias had modified to work on vampire metabolism. Her hands stayed steady as she prepared because panic was a luxury she could not afford. She stepped back into the hallway and caught Marcus's eye across the department, gave him the hand signal they had developed for potential trouble. He nodded fractionally and moved to position himself near the exit. Dr. Reeves was handling the trauma bay, and Lena mentally calculated how to keep him away from the rogues until Cassian arrived. The 3 vampires had not moved, but she felt their attention shift to her as she walked past, felt the weight of predator eyes assessing prey. One of them smiled, and she saw the barest hint of fang before he controlled his expression. The ER doors opened and Cassian walked in with Victor 1 step behind, both dressed in street clothes that did not draw attention. Cassian's eyes found Lena immediately, and she saw him assess the situation in seconds, saw his posture shift into battle readiness that looked like casual confidence to anyone who did not know what to watch for. He moved to the triage desk and spoke quietly to the nurse who checked her computer and directed him toward the waiting area. Victor positioned himself near the hallway that led deeper into the hospital, cutting off one escape route. Lena stayed near the supply closet that gave her access to both the waiting room and the ambulance bay, ready to respond to whatever happened next. The rogue with the head wound stood and started walking toward the exit, casual and unhurried. The one with the sling followed 5 seconds later. The third remained seated watching Cassian with calculation that made Lena's instincts scream. This was coordinated, a test or a trap or both. Cassian let the first 2 reach the door before moving with speed that made humans flinch even though they could not process what they saw. He was between the rogues and exit before they completed another step, his hand on the first one's shoulder, in a grip that looked friendly but made the vampire freeze. "We should talk outside," Cassian said pleasantly, and it was not a suggestion. The third rogue rose, and Lena saw his hand move toward his jacket. She was already moving, syringe palmed and ready, closing distance with the smooth confidence Elias had drilled into her. The vampire saw her coming, and his eyes widened fractionally before she struck, silver-infused needle punching through his shirt into the muscle of his shoulder. He gasped and stumbled, and Lena stepped back as the sedative took effect, as his knees buckled and he went down hard enough to crack the linoleum. The waiting room erupted into chaos as humans registered that something was wrong, as Marcus called for security, as Dr. Reeves rushed over demanding to know what happened. Cassian had the other 2 rogues already moving toward the exit, his voice carrying compulsion that made them walk even as they tried to resist. Victor stayed close, watching for other threats. Lena knelt beside the fallen vampire and checked his pulse for show, called for a gurney as if he had simply fainted. "We need to get him to a private room," she told Dr. Reeves. "Possible seizure disorder, I will handle it." Dr. Reeves looked skeptical but nodded and helped her load the unconscious vampire onto the gurney. Lena wheeled him toward the private examination rooms in the back while her heart hammered and adrenaline sang through her veins. She was no longer just a nurse taking blood pressures and charting vital signs. She was a protector standing between 2 worlds, armed with silver and knowledge, and the bone-deep certainty that this was what she was meant to do. Outside the hospital, Cassian would be interrogating the rogues, learning who sent them and why. Inside, Lena would keep the vampire sedated until they could transfer him somewhere secure. And somewhere in the city more threats were gathering because they always were, because the war Cassian had been fighting for a century never truly ended. The night was just beginning, and Lena felt ready for whatever came next, felt the weight of her purpose settle around her shoulders like armor. She had walked into a hospital room 30 days ago to take blood pressure and walked out into a world of shadows and fangs and impossible choices. She had chosen to stay, chosen to fight, chosen to become something more than she ever imagined. The mark on her wrist burned faintly as if responding to her resolve, and Lena smiled grimly as she locked the examination room door. Let them come, she thought. Let them test the boundaries and probe for weakness. They would find her standing ready with silver in one hand and steadiness in the other, a bridge between worlds and a guardian of the fragile peace. And she was done apologizing for taking up space.